On December 20th, 1983, just days before Christmas, 22-year-old Erin Gilmore was found dead in her apartment in Toronto. Gilmore, the daughter of businessman David Gilmore, lived in an upscale neighborhood and was known for her vibrant personality. Her boyfriend, Andrew Monk, arrived at her apartment to pick her up for dinner and noticed the front door was ajar. When he entered the residence, he discovered her lifeless body in the bedroom, in a state of panic. Monk called 911 and, in shock, initially reported that she may have taken her own life. Once authorities arrived at the scene, it quickly became evident that Erin Gilmore had been the victim of a violent crime. She had been bound and gagged, then stabbed multiple times in both the front and back. Detective Stephen Smith of the Toronto Police later confirmed that investigators believed she had been sexually assaulted. Following a thorough investigation, Monk was ruled out as a suspect after ATM records placed him in another location at the time of the murder. Just 4 months earlier and 2 miles away, 45-year-old Susan Tice was also found murdered in her home. She had been stabbed to death in her bed and, like Gilmore, had been sexually assaulted. Tice was a mother of 4 and a therapist, and at the time of her death, she was going through a contentious divorce. Her brother-in-law discovered her body after she failed to show up for a scheduled family dinner. Initially, her estranged husband was investigated but was later cleared. Despite media attention and extensive investigative efforts, neither murder resulted in an arrest. No suspect was identified at the time, and both cases eventually went cold. For the families of Erin Gilmore and Susan Tice, the pain of their murders did not end with the initial investigations. Instead, it lingered for decades, deepened by the absence of answers. Sean McCowan, Erin's brother, has spoken about the enduring trauma that began in 1983 and shadowed his life for 40 years. Her death left what he described as a permanent hole in their family, an absence that could never be repaired. The lack of justice added a weight that only grew heavier with time. Susan Tice's son, Ben Tice, also carried the burden of unanswered questions. He remembered his mother as a powerful, independent woman, a therapist navigating a painful divorce while asserting her autonomy. Ben described her as a force of nature, someone determined to live on her own terms. The impact of her murder was compounded by the initial scrutiny placed on his father, who became a person of interest during the early investigation. Although his father was eventually cleared, the suspicion cast a shadow over their grieving process. As the years passed, the families were left to endure their sorrow in silence. Despite national media coverage, repeated efforts by detectives, and public interest in the cases, no suspect emerged. The enduring mystery left both families trapped in a cycle of loss without resolution. With no one held accountable and no answers to ease their grief, they continue to live in the long shadow cast by 2 violent, unsolved crimes. In the year 2000, a major breakthrough in forensic science marked a turning point in the investigation. Advances in DNA analysis allowed authorities to revisit the evidence from both crime scenes. Through this technology, the Toronto police confirmed that the same unknown individual was responsible for the murders of Erin Gilmore and Susan Tice. This scientific confirmation validated long-held suspicions that the 2 brutal crimes were connected. Despite this progress, the DNA profile did not lead to a suspect. While investigators had conclusive proof that the 2 cases were linked, they lacked the ability to identify the person behind the profile. At the time, the National DNA Database did not contain the unknown assailant's genetic information, and there was no immediate way to trace it back to a name. With renewed focus, detectives re-examined both cases, looking for patterns that might connect the victims beyond the manner of their deaths. Gilmore and Tice had lived just 2 miles apart, and both were sexually assaulted and stabbed in their homes. However, investigators found no known personal or social link between the 2 women during their lives. The absence of such a connection made the case more challenging. Although the DNA link provided clarity about the crimes being the work of a single perpetrator, it also highlighted the limitations of existing investigative tools. The revelation set the stage for future developments in forensic science, most notably genetic genealogy, that would eventually push the case forward after nearly 2 decades of dormancy. By 2018, investigative genetic genealogy had proven itself as a powerful tool for solving cold cases. The successful identification of California's Golden State Killer using public DNA databases prompted law enforcement agencies around the world to explore similar methods. Motivated by this breakthrough, Toronto authorities enlisted the help of Othram Labs, a forensic lab based in Texas, to apply the same approach to the Gilmore and Tice investigations. Othram's team developed a viable DNA profile from the crime scene evidence. However, they encountered a significant obstacle. The suspect's DNA had characteristics commonly found in individuals with First Nations heritage. This created difficulties because people from First Nations communities were significantly underrepresented in public genealogy databases. Additionally, the genetic homogeneity of the population posed further challenges in distinguishing between individuals. Despite these limitations, Toronto Police's in-house genealogist, James Atkinson, methodically worked through the available data. Through careful analysis, he was able to narrow the DNA source to one specific family with 5 brothers. Investigators began eliminating each brother as a possible match, eventually focusing on Joseph George Sutherland. Sutherland had lived in Toronto at the time of the 1983 murders, but had since relocated to Moosonee, a remote town in northern Ontario. In November 2022, detectives traveled to his residence with a warrant. They encountered Sutherland, who was 60 years old at the time, and described him as calm and polite. He voluntarily accompanied them to a nearby precinct and submitted a DNA sample without resistance. This pivotal development marked the first time in nearly 40 years that investigators had a viable suspect. It was a result of combining cutting-edge forensic science with persistent and methodical detective work. The identification of Sutherland illustrated how technology, when guided by expertise and determination, can bring resolution to even the longest-standing unsolved crimes. Just one day after handing over his DNA sample to Toronto police, Joseph George Sutherland made a confession that no one saw coming, least of all his closest friend. Randy Coda, a retired police officer, had known Sutherland for decades. The two men shared a quiet camaraderie in the remote town of Moosonee, bonding over long days snowmobiling, hunting, and trapping in the northern wilderness. Sutherland, now 60, had always come across as mild-mannered and thoughtful, a man who kept himself but was always dependable. So when he asked to speak with Coda in private, the last thing his friend expected was a revelation that would shatter years of trust. In a voice heavy with emotion, Sutherland admitted that he had done something terrible in his youth. He explained that in 1983, while burglarizing homes in Toronto, he had been confronted by the women who lived there. In a panic, he had sexually assaulted and then stabbed both of them to death. Sutherland described the crimes not with cold detachment, but with a trembling sense of remorse. He said the memories had haunted him for decades, nightmares he could not shake, guilt that never let go. Coda was stunned. The man he thought he knew was now revealing a past stained with brutal violence. Before leaving to take his grandchildren to the train, Coda urged Sutherland not to run. Then, fulfilling his duty, he alerted former law enforcement colleagues about the confession and helped arrange for Sutherland's peaceful surrender. When Coda returned, he spoke directly and firmly. "You lived free for 40 years. Those women's families never got that luxury." Sutherland nodded, defeated. That same night, he walked into the police station and gave himself up. It was a confession born not from pressure, but from shame and the conscience of a man who had spent a lifetime in hiding, only to be brought to justice by friendship and truth. Nearly 40 years after the brutal murders of Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice, justice finally caught up with Joseph George Sutherland. In 2023, Sutherland pled guilty to 2 counts of second-degree murder. During sentencing, the courtroom was silent as he was handed a life sentence, with the possibility of parole after 21 years. For the families of the victims, the decision brought a long-awaited sense of closure, though the wounds left behind could never fully heal. For Sean McCowan, Aaron Gilmore's half-brother, the moment the news broke was overwhelming. He described collapsing in tears, his body trembling as for decades of grief, frustration, and unanswered questions suddenly gave way to relief and release. The pain of losing Aaron had never dulled, but knowing the man responsible would finally face consequences brought a measure of peace. Sutherland's confession, combined with the powerful genetic evidence, left no room for doubt. His acknowledgement of guilt, decades after the crimes, reinforced what investigators had worked tirelessly to prove, that science and perseverance could succeed where time had once failed. Though justice had taken far too long, it had not been denied. Two of Toronto's most haunting cold cases were no longer unsolved mysteries. They were now resolved crimes with a name, a face, and a sentence. Justice may have taken nearly 4 decades, but in the end, it arrived, carried on the shoulders of science perseverance, and the undying love of families who never stopped fighting for answers. Aaron Gilmore and Susan Tice were not forgotten. Their stories were not buried in time, and their names will now forever be linked with a hard-earned justice that refused to be silenced. If this story moved you, please subscribe, and share this video. And let us know in the comments, do you believe justice delayed is still justice served? Thank you for watching.